Hello everyone and welcome to this absolutely fascinating conference by the Hayek Programme and the LSE Hayek Society on liberty and progress. For those of you that have just joined us, my name is Reem Ibrahim and I come from the Institute of Economic Affairs. I was once a student here, once Vice President of the Hayek Society, and a couple of years later I'm happy to be back. I am absolutely delighted to announce this brilliant panel on capitalism and minority rights. We're going to start off with two series of lectures by Dr Victoria Bateman and Dr Mikayla Novak. We're going to start off with Mikayla Novak. Mikayla is the Senior Fellow at the Mercator Centre at George Mason University, and she will explore the intersection of market economies and LGBTQ communities, emphasising opportunities for greater freedom and inclusion. Dr Mikayla, go.
All right, well, thanks very much for that. I mean, it's unusual for me to use a microphone because we Australians are known for bellowing, and so there'll be bellowing, I promise you. So thank you all very much to be here. It's a wonderful honour to be here, actually. It's my first time at LSE. In the 1930s, you were the world leader in economic science. You had Hayek, you had Robbins here, you had other identities here, and very, very soon you'll be world leaders again with the likes of Brian Chang and other wonderful scholars. So we look forward to that. So the purpose of this presentation is actually to build upon work in progress by my colleagues, Nathan Goodman, Jordan Lofthouse and I. We're writing the first book, a edited compilation of writings intersecting classical liberal thinking, not just economics, but sociology, political science, law, history, and LGBT rights. So that will be released, it's under contract with Routledge, released at the end of the year. So this work that I'm presenting is very complementary to the production of that book, in that what I'm seeking to do is to actually, as a work of intellectual excavation, introduce to you some of the sort of key thinking of classical liberal scholars and also activists, and I also refer to rabble-rousers as well, because there are a fair few of those who advanced LGBT rights in modern history. And so you can see the outline obviously here. I'll provide a little bit of an interesting statistical background situating where queer classical liberalism lies. Then I'll be thinking about a trilogy of first ideas, actors, and then actions by those actors. And then I'll finalise by thinking about the values of queer classical liberalism. So I'd imagine a number of you would know through your familiarity with the social sciences that a discipline called queer studies has emerged as a quite vibrant social scientific subdiscipline since the 70s. And this strand of thinking known as queer studies is evident throughout a range of social scientific subdisciplines such as economics, anthropology, history, law, psychology, and so on and so forth. I'll give you a little bit of a statistical sort of flavour of that. So it is actually interesting when thinking about the scholarship of intellectual thought as to why certain disciplines rise, why some of them might fall. And so my sort of immediate sort of hot take on this is that there were certain, what I would call, I use these metaphors drawing from colleagues of mine such as Erwin Decker and Pete Becky and others who make a demarcation between students of society, those who are particularly interested and quizzical about phenomena in the world, versus sort of planners of society, but there are also other other actors within scholarship as well. So a students of society orientation would just be actually merely curious and interested in describing and better understanding the conditions experienced by a marginalised cohort of minority groups. So that this is, obviously gay, lesbian, bi, trans, and others within that sort of broader, admittedly loose alliance, but it exists. So a student of society is simply interested in the sort of lives of a certain sort of segment of the population, goes forth and studies. So it might be interesting to speculate that perhaps the intellectual qua student of society, upon sort of undertaking research, might find themselves being normatively motivated actually by the plight and the conditions and the circumstances of LGBT folks, and they might sort of seek to undertake scholarship with the underlying motivation of wanting to be an emancipator. So there will be some folks in the scholarly community, I have no doubt these days, who are interested in scholarship with an underlying motivation to seek to emancipate marginalised or oppressed minorities. And then that then might transmute into what you might call an activist orientation of scholarship. Now, I happen to think that's quite a contentious stance in scholarship, and I'm sure that some of you actually might well agree, but just because we might actually have some personal opinions or perspectives about it doesn't mean that we shouldn't actually take interest in it as an explanatory, potentially explanatory variable in the world. And so we have not only intellectual interest in isolation, but we could imagine intellectual interest that intersects with broader societal political concerns about LGBT folks. And I'm alluding here to the last dot point about the mainstreaming of queer culture, for better or for worse, depending on one's view. And there are certainly numerous views about the nature and the implications of the mainstreaming view. So there's some brief statistics here. So in my sort of orientation to try to envision a queer classical liberalism, I'm interested in seeing how this might statistically be situated against what we well know. So many of you will know what engrams actually is. All it is basically an aggregator that provides a count of the number of words that exist within a particular language corpus, in this case English. So you can see here, I might be an emancipator, activist emancipator of queer liberalism, but really my crowd is sort of lolling down the bottom there, really, in terms of scholarly recognition, whereas queer studies, as I've just mentioned, since the 1970s, but especially since about 1990, and that's actually interesting, right? Because that's when arguably LGBT culture in the Western countries, at least, became mainstreamed, right? You started seeing queer representation in TV, so newspaper ads, movies, that kind of thing. Okay, so it's interesting. So I mentioned before about representation of queer studies across the different disciplines. So you can see actually right across the sort of gamut of the social sciences, as best as I could represent it here. Even economics has a relatively healthy representation. All these statistics are basically Google Scholar citations of the number of papers that exist. You can actually do this in Google Scholar. I actually had a colleague who said, "Oh, can you actually do this?" Well, it's right here. It's right in front of you, right here. So queer history and law tend to obviously have very healthy representation. You can imagine sort of law being interestingly in the service of state policy. And of course you have political science as well. So there's some statistics there. So thinking about ideological or philosophical disciplines, well, I mean, it's certainly true that non-liberal critical theory really sort of dominates the sort of academic sort of scholarship in queer studies. Now, I will spend a moment actually talking about queer liberalism because, okay, it's ranked second here, and you think, oh, okay, that's really quite healthy, even though it's almost beaten, sort of 10 to 1. But I'll actually argue, as I do right now, that queer classical liberalism probably has a non-presence, and so an implication of that is that the scholarship my colleagues and I are undertaking right now is actually effectively going to be world first scholarship, right? So this hasn't actually been really done before by anyone. So why would I say that the statistical measures for queer liberalism, why might they be deceptive from a classical liberal orientation? Well, because for the reasons I explain here, is that liberalism may be regarded in rather different ways. So you can think about, well, are the studies referring to classical liberalism of Locke and Adam Smith and Hayek, or are they referring to the many sort of studies that Rawls 1971 spawned? What about progressive liberalism? Even, you know, there's even a discipline called liberal socialism. So I can imagine that bona fide queer classical liberal studies are very minimal on the ground. And of course, there's the additional tendency as well that's observable in scholarship to the effect that classical liberalism is largely used by non-liberal leaning scholars as a foil for critique. Okay, and so this gives you all of this, right? So any of you who are familiar with queer studies will be very familiar with, you know, generally an anti-market bent, even a sort of pro-state bent. Here I've sort of selected a whole range of books and academic and non-academic articles which tend to sort of convey, right, this idea that sort of the core commitments of classical liberalism seem to be readily problematized within what you might actually call mainstream queer studies. How about we just call it that? Okay, so the Alexandra Chassin book, Selling Out, problematizes, for example, the mainstreaming of queer culture. But it's basically, Chassin's sort of story is basically a communitarian style story, which is basically saying that sort of, let's say, queer advertising, queer marketing, all of those things are basically corroding like a sense of community in the LGBT sort of cohort. Look, I actually think that's very debatable, but nonetheless, you know, in the interest of balance and giving us a well-rounded view, I mean, this scholarship, right, this voluminous scholarship, which is represented in the stats that I just gave you before, has to be accounted for, okay? All right. So I want to sort of advance a different set of ideas that, you know, that might even challenge your conventional thinking about the core commitments of classical liberalism and how they relate to queer economic, political and social life. And so when I'm referring to classical liberalism, it is true that there are gradations and variations within classical liberalism that might relate to anything from anarcho-capitalism of Murray Rothbard right through to, let's say, a welfare kind of liberalism of, you know, some parts of, you know, John Maynard Keynes and the Cologne School, Alfred Müller-Armack in Germany, right? There's a lot of variety within classical liberalism. Indeed, anyone can actually find a home within that sort of set of ideologies and philosophies. But when I'm referring to classical liberalism, I'm referring to three key things, right? So an endorsement of markets, right, as an arena of interactivity, right, for economic exchange, referring to a open society which is correlative with freedom of association and disassociation, okay, and then finally democratic political life. Actually, democracy is liberal, actually, and I take a James M. Buchanan point, and actually I take a Friedrich Hayek point, right? Read the Constitutional Liberty, right, 1960, I think it's chapter 11, where he gives an endorsement of democracy as a dynamic opportunity for people to reveal their opinions about all sorts of public matters that you can't get in a totalitarian scheme. Okay, so Hayek endorsed democracy too. So let's just think about how the commitments of classical liberalism actually give support and help lead conducive to flourishing queer lives? Well, I actually think markets are extremely beneficial, right, for LGBT people, all minorities actually. It's good for everyone, without exception, right? And here are some of the reasons that I outlined. So outputs produced by markets actually affirm LGBTQ identities and expressiveness that think about fashion, cultural goods, healthcare goods, so on and so forth. Queer people are human beings too, and so they actually use market outputs, right, to symbolise their identity. Symbolism is actually an extremely important function of markets, right? That tends to be underappreciated given the sort of the materialistic dominance, right, of our economic education. But symbolism is very important, and if markets can help people symbolise their identity and find each other, right, in welcoming communities using outputs produced by markets, well, I think that's actually good. Okay. So another important way in which markets can assist sort of queer communities is that queer individuals and queer communities can associate in ways using financial and real resources in markets to mobilise for their key causes, to support key relationships, and I'll get into that in a moment, and to undertake other useful social activities. So, for example, if you were an activist in the LGBT social movement of some kind, it could be any kind, you will typically, in the modern sort of world here that we live in now, you'll typically rely on some kind of market affordance, right, in order to project your activism in the world. Right, for example, social media technology, right, which was developed and galvanized, right, by market forces, for example. Just one example out of many. Economic entrepreneurship. Now, this is another very interesting avenue through which non-economic and non-economic motivations can actually be useful to help undergird queer community life. So, for example, I had a friend in my hometown, Brisbane, Australia, and she ran like a Blu-ray DVD store, like queer films, where people can hire the films, they can buy the films, all that kind of stuff. So, she had this sort of shop in the suburb of New Farm in Brisbane, right? And so I asked her once, well, what was your actual motivation, right, for setting up this business, qua entrepreneurial act, right? And her response was that I'm doing this to support my community. I'm doing this to support my community. What's the response? Okay, so you actually have, and in that one anecdotal example, and there are actually many studies that actually just repeat the point, that there are indeed socialised purposes that motivate action through a market, right, for economic benefit, including for LGBT folks. Markets tend to be anti-discriminatory, and they dissolve hierarchies, especially if they're open and competitive. I don't even have to refer to Becker or Friedman, whose important works affirm that point. I could refer, for example, to the statement made by the German auto-liberal theorist Franz Bohm, who post-war said as follows: economic competition is the most important disempowerment device known to humankind. Competition is disempowerment, not Westminster or whatever Starmer's doing, right? It's, right? Forget about that. It's actually market competition is the most important disempowerment device. Okay, and so you know the mechanisms of disempowerment, right? Of hierarchies, bigoted hierarchies, through, for example, the works of Becker and Friedman. Right? These are operable, and these are being empirically observed. There's literature there, and then. Finally, and I've alluded to this point before, markets facilitate the mainstreaming of LGBT identities and issues, right? And I would argue without necessarily corroding or expunging the uniqueness of queer existence. Why? Because of the intersecting commitment to classical liberalism, right? Which is social freedom. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that sort of market developments or marketing and the like these sort of phenomena don't exude compulsion at all. Any person in the LGBT community can actually just eschew all the marketing. They don't have to go to, let's say, the Sydney Mardi Gras or what have you in order to affirm their identity. If you're living in a free society with social freedom, you can be proudly gay, bi, trans, or what have you, and just lead a quiet life, like I do, actually. So I would say that, in fact, in a number of ways, the classical liberal commitment to market actually is quite supportive of the classical, the queer community, the human desire for association and sociality. It's very clear, actually, that economic entrepreneurs and LGBT community members have actively established safe, heterotopic, Foucault point, heterotopic commercial and non-commercial spaces, right? You can think about all the queer sort of bookstores that are around in any sort of large Western city, for example. The freedom of association, indeed, through gentrification and through other sort of spatialised socio-processes, have led to the establishment and scaling of queer communities. You think about Soho or Greenwich Village, New York, Castro in the Castro district in San Francisco, Darlinghurst in Sydney, Australia, right? You can see a very clear example in which non-totalitarian societies that observe some basic sort of commitment to the idea of classical liberalism, which is free association and disassociation in the social realm, actually facilitate these effects, right, of geographic sorting, even in repressive milieu, repressive environments. So KCL's Adam Tebel has written a very important 2016 book called Epistemic Liberalism, in which he talks about the growth of LGBT districts, even in under repressive social norms back in the 50s and 60s. These things happened, right? These are a reality. This is what happens, right, in a liberal society where there's a basic human thirst for association and to be free to act on the will to association. And as I've said before, resources generated from a market economy actually facilitate socio-political mobilisation. And that actually what undergirds what I might call a queer circuit of commerce. Viviana Zelizer, the economic sociologist, has written an extremely important book about the circuits of commerce. And what she says there is that people shouldn't actually fear money or the money motive. Why? Because individuals are at right in a free society to be able to use that money and even imagine uses of the money, right, that they acquire in a market in whichever way they want. They can even actually acquire financial resources to further non-liberal aims. Why is it actually that in liberal societies such as ours, we actually have a flourishing of non-liberal organisations? The circuits, right, of commerce is actually the reason why, right, that even non-liberal communities can actually grow and actually prosper, even in liberal societies. That's very interesting when you think about it. And significantly, I think, allowance for the greater measure of personal autonomy and agency in liberal societies equip LGBT communities and their members with a basic capabilitarian freedom to be yourself. And actually, this is another important, a very underappreciated point. The classical liberal journalist, the famed journalist, I hope you know his name, Samuel Brittan, right, wrote a book in 1973 called Capitalism and the Permissive Society. In this 1973 book, Capitalism and the Permissive Society, he says exactly these kinds of points, that people are at liberty, right, in free economies and free societies to be able to use the resources garnered, right, in those conditions, right, to be able to pursue their aims, objectives and desires and wants, even if they might be seen by a moral majority to be permissive, right? Markets allow this, freedom of association, open societies allow for this. Finally, I will unashamedly tell you, actually, that democracy is liberal. Democracy is classical liberal. right? Look at James Buchanan, for example, an ardent liberal. Everyone counts. Everyone counts, right, in a liberal political democracy, in a political society. And that has to include some people whose modes of behaviour or conduct we may not understand or may not even like. Well, I mean, it's too bad. You actually live, in a democratic society and everyone actually has agency for as long as they're not harming anyone else. It's the million principle, to be able to lead their lives. Okay, and so that's the democratic political ethos, that everyone counts, everyone gets a right to participate, right? And so in a democratic liberal society, political dynamics, this is the Hayekian point that I made before, offers LGBTQ people and others, including people who may be opposed, right, to LGBT folks and their causes, to inform public opinion and persuade others on politically salient topics. For example, think about some of the successes in certain countries with respect to the same-sex marriage debate. I mean, that's actually democracy as a processual phenomena at work, right? That absolutely has to be. Right, and of course, finally, modern democracies are typically grounded in constitutional legal guarantees upholding freedom of assembly, speech, and forms of expression. Right, these are valorised, lauded rights, right, that are available to all free-thinking people. It is true, of course, that the relationship between the organs of the state, known as government, and LGBTQ communities have been very fraught. Discriminatory policies, police brutality. Recently in the US, and there's sort of rumblings here and other places in the Western world, there's sort of rollback on sort of issues that affect trans folks, for example, and they're very contentious debates. But we note these points, and as scholars, we have every right to actually examine the nature and implications of those changes, right, from a scholarly perspective, but one could actually say from an agential perspective in a liberal democracy in which everyone gets a say, everyone has a right to participate, that yes, I mean, there may be some occasional rollbacks. People have a right to change their opinions about issues. That's a Hayekian point, and that's fine. But if that's the case, then before members of the LGBT community, if they so choose, they are also at liberty to try to change, to modify their key arguments, their key framings, and to engage, again, with the majority of the community in a discussion, a Knightian discussion, as opposed to a debate. There's a key difference between the two, actually. Okay, so getting toward the sort of the finish of my presentation here, so hopefully we have plenty of time for discussion. So what I want to say about the admittedly relatively small body of scholarly activity with respect to a conspicuously identifiable queer classical liberalism is that, in actual fact, and myself included, a number of queer classical liberals have actually drawn upon some interesting intuitions and insights from self-identifying non-liberals, actually. John D'Amelio, he's not a classical liberal, but he actually wrote something very, very important in 1975, a paper called Capitalism and Gay Identity, which has been republished in various places. Now, what D'Amelio says, and this is actually very interesting given the discussion we had in the previous session, so D'Amelio's basic argument is that individual real wages grew, right, historically, and because the emphasis on individual wage rates grew, that gave opportunities for individuals who may have repressed let's say their homosexuality, or may have repressed their trans identity in the past, to extricate themselves from the bonds of family. So remember the sort of evolution of the family. The evolution of the family up until probably around, just after the Industrial Revolution used to be a site of economic production, right? If a family didn't produce anything from in-house, family members starve, right? But because of the Industrial Revolution, individual workers were able to attain enough healthy, growing, rising wages to be able to do their own thing, including, if they needed to leave their family, right, situations and to lead a new life, which affirms some of these identities. Dennis Altman, an Australian, Geoffrey Escoffier, who's actually a great writer about LGBT life, but he's not a classical liberal, but he's still great. They both talk about the importance of commercial venues, right? Commercial venues, right, as sites of association, right, especially for minorities who felt very much repressed during the 40s, 50s and 60s when there were a lot of police brutality around, especially in the US and other places too. Even in my home country, there were many historical stories of police brutality in Australia. But, commercial venues are extremely important. And I'm not only talking about gay bars, I'm talking about cafes, restaurants, whole range, bookstores. There are many examples of commercial histories that are yet to be uncovered that actually tell you the story about how markets and identity are actually interlinked. Okay? And then finally, Dean Spade. He's a trans activist, and he talks about mutual aid societies, right, and how important they might actually be to queer life. And so Dean Spade is not a classical liberal, but someone like me as a classical liberal be very happy to actually take his insights and to be able to, look, I'm appropriating it, that's fine. That's what you actually do in intellectual life, right? You copy and you build, right? That's completely appropriate and fair game. Okay, and so I take these non-liberal insights, and others do who wish to build a scholarship of queer classical liberalism. And I also refer to some sort of friends and colleagues, Roderick Long, my colleague Nathan Goodman, Jason Byers. These are very important figures in what they call left-wing market anarchism, right? To think about how markets and classical liberalism can actually be used to achieve what might be politically or normatively assessed to be, let's say, left of centre, right? That phrase was used before, left of centre political or normative priorities. You can use markets, open societies and liberal democracy, right? You can use those commitments and draw upon them and be inspired by them, right, to actually advance agendas and improve the lives of marginalised, oppressed minorities, including LGBT folks. So, unsurprisingly, I mean, there's a small sort of set of LGBT folks and their allies that have actually prosecuted the case for intersecting classical liberal thinking and the study of LGBT life. So we've got a whole list of figures here. So any from John Stuart Mill right through to Deirdre McCloskey today, Ralph Rako, there are many others. We've got even the two people actually in the 21st century list that are actually here this evening, and they're very important allies of queer classical liberalism, Pete Becky, Steve Horwitz and others. So what I just wanted to do, I'm very close to wrapping up, and thank you for your patience. So this statement is drawn, and I'll read a bit of the fine print for you. This is actually in Hayek's Constitution of Liberty. Right. He says, where private practices cannot affect anybody but the voluntary adult actors, the mere dislike of what is being done by others, or even the knowledge that others harm themselves by what they do, provides no legitimate ground for concern. And then he has a footnote talking about the most conspicuous instance of this in our society is that of the treatment of homosexuality. Okay, so Hayek's arguments are receptive here. So in wrapping up, want to sort of talk about the actions by which queer classical liberals have prosecuted their agenda, not only intellectually, but also in the form of activism. So you might see a range of alternative media, for example. A good example of this, I would say, would be a group called the Centre for a Stateless Society, which actually run a lot of articles which are very LGBT friendly. And then you actually have, in addition to that, the evidenced inclination of research bodies, think tanks, activism within political parties, social movements, and so on and so forth, trying to argue the case. So, for example, the decriminalisation of sodomy, for example, in the 50s and 60s, a number of classical liberal arguments were used in advance of those arguments. The freedom of the individual, right? These so-called victimless crimes, they're not crimes at all, they're just free acts by individuals together. And also the case for same-sex marriage as well drew upon classical liberal argumentation. So there are, you can imagine all of these and other examples as being cases of non-economic entrepreneurship, some of which actually might actually have some economic dimension, because you've got to fund some of these activities, surely. Okay, so you can think about these examples as cases of entrepreneurship in the broad. Right? Entrepreneurship is not limited to its economic instantiation. Fundamental principle of classical liberalism is that of creating conditions for freedom and flourishing of individuals without exception. Everybody counts. Everyone counts under liberalism. And I think that's one of the most compelling arguments that classical liberals can make. Free markets, open competition, voluntaristic trade, limited government bound by the rule of law and non-discrimination, very important for the LGBT community. Finally, a robust civil society, right, that is undergirded by freedom of association and expression, cosmopolitan ethics, and a self-limiting attitude, right, in terms of your interaction with others, right? So avoiding violence, right? If you encounter people or acts that you disapprove of, you don't engage in violence, and that is the fundamental spirit of liberalism in practice. Queer classical liberalism, which is the research agenda advance henceforth, extends the liberal priority of equality to LGBTQ community members, implying that queer individuals who have been among the most marginalised in society actually do have much the same rights and privileges as others. Therefore, queer classical liberalism is argued to be the fullest realisation of classical liberalism itself, because more people count, right, under this philosophical ideological scheme. Right? So queer classical liberalism, in our view, provides a host of unique intellectual perspectives on the value of freedom in promoting the status of LGBTQ people and the constructive roles that market civic freedoms and democracy can all play to empower and emancipate gender and sexual minorities. Queer classical liberalism demonstrates that liberal concerns and priorities are not restricted to economics, especially concerns surrounding the materialist affordances of markets to enable people to achieve and undertake extra economic aims and objectives. Again, queer classical liberalism is ultimately animated by a spirit that liberal ideas are applicable to and beneficial for all people, and that includes members of the LGBTQ community. I thank you very much for your time and really looking forward to questions which will come, I'm sure, henceforth. Thank you.
Okay, that was absolutely brilliant, and I think what's really interesting about that is, I mean, you are one of the only. You can come to this. You are one of the only academics in this in queer sociology specifically that are actually advocating against the prevailing narrative, which is that capitalism is actually exploitative, or that it is somehow harmful to minorities, and I think that's really interesting. We'll come on to questions in a moment. We're going to hear from Dr Victoria Bateman first, and then ensure if you have any questions, please make sure you remember them, either note them down or remember them in your head, so we can ensure that we have a hopefully quite fruitful discussion. But without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Dr Victoria Bateman. Victoria is an economic historian and author specialising in gender and economic history. She will discuss themes from her forthcoming book, Economica Analysing the Global History of Women, Wealth and Power. Victoria, after you.
Well, thank you ever so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. Now, women are quite literally the origin of the world, as Gustave Courbet, the painter of what is probably the most controversial image in art history, knew well. It's shown here in the middle of the screen. I have resisted showing an even greater such image, so this is the tamed version of this presentation. The ability of womankind to create new life meant that women have always been highly valued in history, particularly when the planet was much less populated than it is today. And remember, it took until about 20,000 years ago for the planet's population to reach just 1 million. So until then, we were talking about thousands of people rather than the billions of people that we talk about today. The fact that people were so scarce meant that fertility was extremely important. Women produced the labour resources that drove all of the work that needed to be done in the forests, in the woodlands, on the savannas, and so on. And so women were very much associated with prosperity from early on in history. Here we have an image. It is a stone carving. It's from West Bengal. It's from the 1st century BCE. And it's the goddess who bestows riches. And this goddess is often depicted handing out gold coins. And actually, you can see at her foot, just here, you can see a male figure. And just beneath this image, actually, he has a begging bowl. And so he's there before the goddess of prosperity, wanting some of that prosperity for himself. Victorian anthropologists and Marxist feminists have been for a long time pretty much united in the view that the earliest human societies were not patriarchal, but instead matriarchal. And I say that in the sense of being, first of all, matrilineal. Now, what do we mean by matrilineal? We mean that your name, your status, inheritance passes down the female line rather than the male line. In addition to being matrilineal, in that sense, they were matrilocal. And that means that, obviously, to avoid inbreeding, human societies need to mix with one another. Relationships need to be sparked. But rather than women being the people that were exchanged between communities, it was men who were the people that were exchanged between communities. And this is increasingly now being established by archaeologists looking at the DNA remains of skeletons found in archaeological digs from thousands of years ago. And in fact, just earlier this year, so in 2025, archaeologists based here in the UK managed to show that Iron Age Dorset here in the UK was matrilineal and matrilocal, that the female skeletons that they found in Iron Age Dorset are much more highly related to one another than the male skeletons were. So in other words, women stayed within their own communities, whereas men were the people exchanged from outside. Now, the reverence that was offered to women in these early communities is visible in the mother goddesses that we find again in archaeological digs from right across the world. I have a few examples here. So we have, for example, the mother goddess there from ancient Egypt in that lovely blue colour. We have in the middle, we have mother goddesses from Pakistan. We have a mother goddess from Indonesia. And then perhaps my favourite on the left is the mother goddess from Catalhoyuk. Does anybody know Catalhoyuk? Yes. So where is Catalhoyuk? Tell me.
So what is now Turkey?
Yeah, what is now Turkey? Now it is arguably, it's debatable, arguably the first city in human history. So 9,000 years ago, Catalhoyuk was an urban community in which people lived in relatively square homes built of brick and clay. The front door was essentially on the roof. and the roofs of these homes formed the streets. There was a ladder up to the roof, so if you wanted to enter from ground level, you went up the ladder and then down inside the home, and the rooftops of these homes formed the street level, where a lot of mingling activity went on. Now, what's really interesting about this city, so remember, I'm talking about 9,000 years ago. Archaeologists have studied this city, and they found that looking at the graves, women were sent off into the afterlife with the same amount of fanfare as men. Whereas in more recent archaeological findings, in more recent history, often what you find is men are buried with more treasures than women, indicating that they're perhaps seen as more valuable than women. Another interesting thing based on findings of Capitalism Hayek is that the women are as well nourished as the men. So again, there isn't a gender gap in that sense. So actually, Capitalism Hayek seems to be a relatively gender equal community in which women had quite a lot of power within the community. The problem is that that which is most prized in our society is also that which is most vulnerable. And so women's fertility presented a double-edged sword. It could lead women to positions of equality and power within their societies, but it could also lead them to be captured and controlled. The people that we most, as human societies, want to capture and control are those people who are most valuable, so that the economic prosperity that they can create for us, that we can try and extract that for ourselves. So women's lives were actually on a knife edge. This lovely early history of perhaps female-led communes where we're in this happy society, it wasn't really a stable equilibrium. We were on a knife edge. And what happened with time was that more and more of those equal and even matriarchal societies moved in a patriarchal direction. I mean, perhaps you can understand men perhaps were not always so happy in those societies. And so particularly as you get movable capital, movable wealth, men can move away, for example, take command of their own herds, and then they want to buy or take, more importantly, take wives who can be more submissive. So society moved in this more patriarchal direction. And as society, as wealth grew over time, these patriarchal societies are then coming into competition and conflict with one another. And the result of that was, of course, warfare. Now, one of the most shocking findings I think I've come across in the whole of my study of archaeology is a big event that happened between about 7,000 and 5,000 years ago. And during that time, the genetic diversity of human males collapsed across Eurasia and Africa to the point that male genetic diversity was only 1/17 of female genetic diversity. Now, why did that happen? What archaeologists propose is that by this point we were already living in relatively patriarchal societies, where women were the people being exchanged between communities. Now, what happens as those societies compete and go to war with one another is, of course, they start to extinguish one another. Now, if men are all concentrated, if grandfathers, fathers, children, grandchildren are all concentrated in the same community and that community gets wiped out, that's that gene pool gone. If women are the people that are being exchanged between communities, the female member of that community can be wiped out, but her sister's off somewhere else, the DNA still survives. So we know that between about 7,000 and 5,000 years ago, when we experienced this collapse in genetic diversity, that the world had moved in this patriarchal direction, consistent with greater competition, greater warfare happening between communities. Now here, these images, Assyrian images from the 2nd millennium BC. Assyrian art is filled with battle scenes. We have here an Assyrian cavalryman. Really, you can always spot an Assyrian soldier because he will have a canonical hat and he will have a quiver on his back for the arrows and also a rather big beard. What's interesting in this image of Assyrian warfare is you have again the chief soldier at the back of the boat commanding an underling here, and then you have 2 female captives. The male victim of this warfare is dead in the sea. So what typically happened as these societies are fighting one another is that women are captured. Women are seen as the valuable resource. They are put to work producing the next generation of soldiers or producing the cloth that can be used in global exchange as part of global currency. The men typically are killed off. They're seen as a threat. They're seen as less valuable, less of a benefit and more of a cost. So these are Assyrian fighters in the 2nd millennium BC. This is the 2nd millennium AD. Any thoughts what perhaps big empire might be being depicted there? Yeah. Oh, a little bit before that, but actually there are some artistic similarities actually. So, yeah.
It's the Mughal Empire.
So, and again, some artistic similarities. I'm going to take you back a little bit before the Mongol Empire, but yes, we could move. Yes, I mean, human conflict and empires, it's been going on, hasn't it, throughout the last few millennia. So we could equally bring in images for those empires as well. So the Mongols, starting off, of course, north of China, end up all the way in Baghdad. So conquering the Islamic Empire based in Baghdad. Okay. And thereafter, what happens is that either through these very powerful states or through social practices, you see laws and society conspiring to further constrain women's freedoms. And they do this in a number of different ways. I put just a few here on the slide. The concept of illegitimacy. In those early societies where women were really quite powerful, there was no concept of illegitimacy. Every child was born of a woman. You know who the mother of a child is. So a child could never be illegitimate. The concept of illegitimacy comes once you see children as the property of their fathers rather than of their mothers. Because of paternity uncertainty, because the father of a child cannot be known for sure, that opens up the door to illegitimacy, to someone saying, well, they're not my child, they're not mine, they're not yours. Who is the father of this child? So the concept of illegitimacy, and closely related to that, guardianship systems put in place through legal systems. So Hammurabi, King Hammurabi of the Babylonian Empire, 2nd millennium BC, not too far off the time of that Assyrian Empire, King Hammurabi writes this code in which he makes women the property of men, essentially putting in place what we might see as perhaps the first guardianship system. And with that, not only are women becoming the property of men, but their children are becoming the property of the father. So hence, with that, the idea of illegitimacy. Other ways that the state and society are depriving women of their freedoms, as we trot through this long history, obviously denying women access to politics. Ancient Greek, seen as the founding, the birthplace of democracy, but only for men, not for women. Denying women access to government bureaucracies. So when King Hammurabi first takes power in the ancient Middle East, women were actually featured in government bureaucracies. As the Babylonian Empire gets to its later period, women are not present in bureaucracies, and neither are they present as witnesses in legal accounts. Neither are they present as, for example, beer sellers, which they traditionally always had been. Female-run religious places of worship were now run by men. So women being pushed out of administrative roles, female genital mutilation. If you want to control who your daughter is having sex with as a father, female genital mutilation is a great way of going about it, because it virtually stops her from having sex until you want her to, until she's married off, and then she can be reopened up and used by her partner that is of her father's choosing. So female genital mutilation that makes sex very painful for women and means that they don't have that control over their body. Other things, guilds and male-only educational institutions, so businessmen getting together and writing their own little industry-level regulations that lock women out. Similarly, educational institutions. So historically, for example, women were active as the medics in our communities. You know, way before modern day medicine, women were doing a lot of the caring and looking after the sick within their families and their communities. They had important roles as midwives within their communities. But what happens as medicine becomes more institutionalized, as you see educational institutions setting themselves up, is male medics see women medics as competition. And so they don't allow women to study formal medicine. Clothing restrictions, so back to those Babylonians. Hammurabi with his code of his guardianship laws. What you also see in Babylonian times is the use of clothing as a way to control women and to mark women out. So the Babylonian Empire insisted that all women cover up, veil, apart from slave women and harlots. And then clothing becomes a great way of distinguishing between people on the basis of rank. And the punishments for being disobedient in that sense were harsh. So if you were a harlot and you were found veiling out publicly, you were to be stripped naked in public, you were to be caned 50 times, and you were to have pitch poured over your head for trying to pass as a respectable woman. If you were a slave girl and you tried to dress as a respectable woman, covering your head, then you had your ears chopped off. So clothing restrictions, clothing laws became a way of trying to control women and put separating divides between them. Secluding women, so not allowing them to mix with men at the marketplace, out in the wider world. Foot binding, so the practice of foot binding in China develops at the start of the 2nd millennium AD, becomes so widespread that some would estimate that between 60 and 80% of Chinese women had their feet bound. Tended to be more common in cloth-producing parts of China than in rice-producing parts of China. With cloth production, foot binding enables you to, with your daughter or your daughter-in-law, to contain her at her spinning wheel or her weaving machine, to restrict her freedom of movement. She can't wander, she can't go off and create a life for herself. So it's another way, a social practice that develops to try and capture and control women, and through that to capture and control the value that they are creating for their societies, preventing women from capturing their own value. So I think, what does this also, and there are lots of other things we could add to this. Of course, aside from foot binding, many of these things are still an issue in the world today. And what I would argue is that both historically and in the world today, it is not markets that are the biggest obstacle to women's rights and women's equality. It is the state and society. It is laws and it is social practices that restrict women's freedom so that either their family or their society can control and capture the value that they create. Now, the very sad thing is, the ironic thing is that when societies do that, when societies try to control women in these ways, they actually undermine the basis of wealth. So the very attempt to capture the prosperity that women create means that you undermine that, because ultimately societies can only be prosperous if, as individuals, we are able to make our own decisions about our lives. We need to be free as individuals to earn our own money. We need to be free to do so without shame. We need to be free to spend that money as we wish, and we need to be free to save and invest that money. And all of those things are things that sadly women couldn't take for granted throughout history, and still many women in the world today cannot take for granted. The right to earn your own money, the right to do so without shame, the right to spend it as you wish, the right to save, the right to invest. Things that typically actually many men in the world have been able to take for granted. Sadly not the case for women. So if there's one point that you want to take away from today, it's not markets that are the biggest obstacle that women face, it is the state and society. Now, that brings me to the West's journey from exploitation to liberation. We only have to look back, say, 400 years ago. Northwestern Europe, Britain, France, Holland, Belgium, in the middle of the second millennium AD, really wasn't that noticeable in global circles. You know, Europe was relatively poor. Its scholars were less advanced than scholars in, say, India, the Middle East, and China. Its technologies were less sophisticated. It was a poorer place. And yet, it managed to transform itself and become the richest part of the world. Went from poverty to prosperity. How did it do that? Well, I argue throughout my work that Europe had a secret weapon, and that secret weapon was supporting and increasing the freedoms of ordinary women. And I have some historical images here to just give a taste of perhaps how women's lives in Europe differed from women's lives, say, in China, India, the Middle East, the parts of the world that had historically been at the top of the world economic ranking. So first of all, this image here of a fish market, 1568. It's a fish market in the Low Countries, so we're talking there Belgium, Holland. And notice here that you have women basically on both sides of the counter. They're selling fish, they're buying fish, they're out in a public space. They're mixing with men. They're free to shop, they're free to sell. We compare that with, say, the Qingming Scroll from China, which shows an outside space, an urban outside space in a Chinese city. You have about 500 people in it, 20 of them are women, 20 of 500. You compare that with the market scenes that we see depicted in Europe, and as I say, you see women on both sides of the counter. They're out there, they're mixing with men. Their lives are not restricted in the same way, whether by law or by social practices. It was common, it became the norm, really at least from the Black Death, so we're talking about the 1300s, possibly even before that. It became common for young single women to go out to work to earn their own living. Being a milkmaid was one of the most popular choices for teenage girls. So you could move away from your home, get an annual renewable contract on a farm with full bed and board, as well as an annual salary. that allowed you to live your own independent economic existence. Or you could be a domestic servant. This is Auguste Renoir's painting of a young female servant in France. So young single women could go out to work and earn their own existence. That compared with, for example, in China, India, and the Middle East, where teenage girls were being married off at a young age, without that ability to go out into the workplace to earn their own money, and then with that to take charge of the big decisions that affected them in their lives, including the marriage decision. And then we get to married women. Now, married women, really as part of that historic guardianship style system, even in Europe, were restricted by the laws of coverture. So single women were considered free, but once you got married, you were seen as covered by your husband, hence the word coverture. So anything you earned and any assets you bring into the marriage essentially become your husband. So you form a communal pot, essentially, you and your husband, and he's in charge of it. Now, this was rather restrictive for women's ability to continue their work and their entrepreneurship after marriage, because if you do not count as an independent citizen, who wants to do business dealings with you? Because your word doesn't count. You can't sign contracts. You need your husband to do that. Simply, your husband might be a little bit reluctant for you to start your own business, because if that goes, belly up, he's responsible for the debts, not you. So the system of coverture really restricted women's ability to continue their work and their entrepreneurship. But what was invented here in London in medieval times, femme sole status, which was a way for married women to apply to get the same rights as single women. And so it became very common for married women to run their own businesses. In the 1400s, about 40% of brewers in the London Brewers Guild were women. So brewing was a common thing to do as a woman. In the Royal Exchange, not so far away, over in the City of London, almost within throwing distance, by the end of the 17th century, about a half of the retail space was rented by women. In Amsterdam, in the early 18th century, about 10% of merchants were women. And in towns like Leiden, between about 30 and 40% of shopkeepers were women. And whilst men typically sold things like brandy and tobacco, if you wanted to buy chocolate or tea or coffee, it was typically a woman that you would be buying it from. So women typically ran chocolate and coffee and tea houses. So if we're trying to explain how the West grew rich, then I think actually we need to look specifically at women's rights, the rights of ordinary women to earn their own money, to do so proudly, to decide how to spend it, and to save and invest. This is one of my favourite examples of women's participation in the economy throughout history. It is a business card. There's a whole collection of these business cards held in the British Museum. They date from the 18th century. They are the business cards of London-based women. And this here is a woman called Dorothy Mercer. She is a print seller and stationer. You can find her in Windmill Street, facing Silver Street, by Golden Square. I don't know if you get out a historic map of London, you might find where her shop is. This was before street numbers. So you've got street names, but not street numbers. And it tells you what she sells. She sells all kinds of things. She sells prints. She sells pencils, black, red and white chalk. It says also that she sells flower drawings, flower watercolours that she has painted herself. So not only is she a stationer and printer, she is an artist. Clearly very proud of her work. But sadly, whenever and wherever markets have supported the freedom of ordinary women to make their own decisions about their lives, we've seen backlashes. We see it from the patriarchy, and we see it from, I'm afraid to say, from within feminism as well. Now, the patriarchy is perhaps pretty self-explanatory, why perhaps the patriarchy doesn't like all of these independent women running around making the most of their lives. But what about feminists? Why is it that we find so much left-leaning opposition from feminists in regard to the market? Well, first of all, I think it is a rose-tinted view of history, one that fails to appreciate the way in which the state and society have controlled to restrict women's freedoms. But more than that, I think, first of all, there is the issue that in any equal marketplace, if you are a woman producing children, you are inherently at an economic disadvantage because of the unpaid reproductive and caring labour that comes with that. And that, I think, when you look at many Marxist feminist theories, it is the idea that society can help you solve that trade-off between family and work by providing, for example, workplace nurseries, communal dining halls and that type of thing. But what I would say as someone of more of a classical liberal bent is what that tells me is that it's one thing to be trading off work and family if you haven't chosen the family. It is another if it is an active choice. So where that takes me really is to the importance of this concept, my body, my choice. Across the world, around 1 in 2 pregnancies are not planned, are not intended. That means there is a lot of care work going on and reproductive labour going on that women have not chosen. When you work out the amount of caring labour that women do across the world, it is the equivalent to 2 billion people working full-time for nothing. And this really costs women in terms of their pay packet, in terms of their ability to progress in the marketplace. Now, as I say, it's one thing to do that if you've chosen it. It is another thing if you've been married off young and have very little choice over the number of children you go on to have. And then the next big thing, I think, that helps explain why you find so many feminists on the left so resistant to the idea of markets is the fear of the monetization of women's bodies. So they point to the raunch culture that we have all around us. They point to the global sex trade. They point to pornography. And they argue that women's bodies are not for sale. Now, I think this argument reduces down to 2 things. Firstly, the denial of the idea that any woman might choose to monetize her body. I know plenty of people in the sex industry that choose to monetize their body, but what do radical feminists say to them? You're brainwashed, you don't know your own mind, you've been socialized. So just denial of their individual choice, a denial of their individual identity. The second argument that is made is even if you are making that choice to monetize your body, that you are generating a negative externality for all other women, and so your choice should be restricted. The claim is that if women are selling sex, then it turns all women into sex objects, and so we need to stop the sale of sex. Now, negative externalities can, I think, take us into rather tricky territory. If you're in a communist country and you're talking about socializing the means of production, what do those means of production include? Women's wombs, taking us back to the start of this talk. If you're putting society's interest ahead of the individual, then you would be telling women how many children they can and can't have for the good of their country, which is, of course, what has happened time and time again in communist systems. it's also interesting that the typically middle-class women that make this claim that sex workers are doing terrible things by turning us into sex objects are not making the same arguments in regard to, for example, paid care workers. So, this side of things would argue that the problem is that women are stereotypically placed in the role of caregivers, and that means that the burden of unpaid care is placed on women. And so we need to break that stereotype of women as caregivers so that everyone can share care equally. So if we want to break the stereotype of women being sex objects, and we want to break the stereotype of women being caregivers, why are the same feminists that are suggesting we need to abolish the sex trade not at the same time saying let's abolish paid care work so that we can stop, all these women cleaners and women caterers going about their business, creating this impression amongst men that women are there to cook and clean for them. So there's a lot of hypocrisy there. And it takes me to this quote from Milton Friedman. Underlying most arguments against the free market is a lack of belief in freedom itself. That what we have in feminist circles is feminists wanting my body, my choice for them when it comes to, say, abortion rights, but not my body, my choice for other women. You can monetize your brain, you can't monetize your body. So I think my body, my choice is an extremely powerful concept for classical liberals. It goes well beyond fertility. It goes much more deeply than that. It challenges us, I think, to think about the boundaries of markets and society, to expose moralistic judgment, and hopefully place ourselves on the path towards a freer world.
Victoria, thank you so much. That was amazing. I really have so many questions myself, but I'm going to open up to the floor because I'm sure you all also have questions as well. We're going to run until about 8 o'clock. So, questions, hands up? Yes, loads. Okay, here.
My question mainly goes to Dr. Novak, but can be answered by anyone. What I want to ask is, so I feel like there are at least some thinkable scenarios in which certain minority rights might not be furthered by free markets. Depending on how fractioned they are, I think there are definitely. So my question is a bit how would you respond to that, and what do you think about a more selective employment of market mechanisms depending on the kinds of liberties we want to further?
That's a good question, so thank you for asking it. So my initial reaction to this is that both markets and society don't have a teleology, don't have a purpose to start with. And going further, there's no obligation for people to use the affordances of markets for whichever purpose, but they're also at liberty to do so if they so choose. And the same for society. So it doesn't have to be necessarily the case that sort of queer people have to use sort of markets to fulfil their own purposes. But I think it would seem to me that the institutional sort of structures of a liberal society, thinking more broadly, which includes freedom of economic interactivity, will actually sort of provide an array of abundances for people who wish to do so in order to use as material affordances in the ways that they wish to, to further their own purposes, or it might not. And indeed, there are many actual, interesting groups in the world that actually try to and individuals that try to shrug off, what they may sort of self-perceive the sort of the troubling vagaries of markets or the troubling sort of effects. So, you know, you can think of all ranges of religious sects or something like that, or, you know, communes. You can think of, for example, I remember sort of reading about, you know, these groups in my sort of childhood in the 80s. You know, lesbian separatist groups were a big thing where they tried to sort of eschew a lot of the sort of commercial world. It is interesting to think, though, that if autarky is ever achievable, it can probably really only be achievable at small scale, and probably is not really a sort of a feasible line of action anyway. Because what is so fascinating about human beings is our not only the fact of our interdependence, but our perceived necessity for it. So because of specialisation under division labour, and you know, you all know about this concept, we're actually all intertwined. But the intertwinedness doesn't, sorry, you're sort of views being obscure, but that's okay. So the intertwinedness doesn't connote obligation either.
Also, you mentioned Gary Becker in your talk.
Sure.
I think that if you could you explain the economics of discrimination and
Sure,
why markets and why free labour markets effectively usually result in less discrimination? Yeah,
and Victoria will have a view about this as well, because it definitely relates to sort of the economic status of women. But Gary Becker, the Chicago economist, made the claim, which is actually empirically proven, not only by economists, but there are interesting sociological studies affirming this, that effectively it is true that, technically true, that in a free society you might wish to disassociate and you might even have bigoted norms. But Becker's logic is that there's actually a cost associated with your discrimination. If you're trying to extricate yourself from an interdependent world upon which you rely upon others, that comes actually primarily at a cost to you individually. So in the sort of case of, you know, LGBT discrimination, those discriminators, let's say discriminating proprietors of firms, they actually endure a cost of their discrimination by not bringing in talented, albeit queer people, into their workplaces if they have the capacity. So that's Becker's insight. And so so the implication there is that the more open, competitive that markets actually are, they actually reveal these costs of discrimination. They actually increase the costs of discrimination because there's sort of far more choice available.
And ultimately then makes them less profitable, right? If you're a business discriminating against somebody based on anything other than the fact that they are least likely to do a good job, then that you bear the cost of it. Now some businesses might be willing to bear the brunt of those costs, but I suppose the point is that they become less profitable.
There's a nice example from the 19th century. So I talked about how women were active doing all kinds of jobs in the workplace, and I also mentioned how often you get these backlashes against that. So towards the end of the Industrial Revolution, you get a backlash against women working, and the whole idea of the housewife starts to emerge, women becoming the angel of the house, men being out earning money. And increasingly you get workplaces refusing to hire women. But it's not the businesses themselves that are driving that, it is male-dominated trade unions. So you look at, for example, the hatters' unions, the spinners' unions, the printers' unions. It's actually male workers ganging up together across multiple workplaces to put pressure on their employers to not employ women. So
that's really interesting. Other questions? Excellent. Okay, let's go from this way left. So you at the back.
Yeah, my question is for Victoria. I really like the talk. It's a bit of a less economic question, but in regards to like the start of your talk, when you were talking about like how empires, very like ancient empires, they used to kind of balance out male and female roles. Like I can relate to that because like the Persian Empire, I know that like they had very like similar roles between female and male, and even to this day, like the resonance of that is still seen because like in our language we say like hamsar for like spouse, and that means equal in authority.
Yeah.
And like the way the thing I was going to ask is that transfer from like empires having those equal roles to then subjugating women to like the sexism in a way.
Yeah.
Do you think there's like a comparison there with like slavery and how like the Europeans benefited of this portrayal of black people in a way where they could like have control over them, and
Absolutely.
is that the same as like how men maybe did that to women for their own benefit?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It is the, as I say, the people that are most valuable, the people that can create the most value, that are most prized, that are those that are most vulnerable to capture and control, whoever they are. I mean, I think population dynamics play into this a lot, because I think it's particularly in periods of history where there are concerns that the population isn't increasing fast enough, that then there is a tendency to want to control people. So if there are shortages of labour, now whether that is, for example, enslaving people, or whether it is enslaving specifically women to then take charge of their reproductive power to then in turn produce more people, but very much parallels there.
Interesting. Other questions? Yeah, here at the front.
I get that people who may be against my body, my choice may be, I guess, hypocritical in a sense.
Yeah.
But would you argue that the sex industry in general, regardless of gender, is damaging to the mentality of both men and women who consume it and the children who may be exposed to it?
So certainly that is a very common argument that is made. And what I would say is, for example, if the sex industry is warping men's views of women's bodies, then the problem isn't actually the sex industry. The problem is that the only time we see women's bodies is when it's associated with sex. Because as a society, we've moved away from a time when people could, think about thousands of years, we wandered around scantily clad. The body did not mean sex. You didn't instantaneously see a naked body and think sex. I mean, you might have thought that, but, it was the norm. It wasn't the act of removing clothes that made us naked. It was the act of wearing clothes. And once we started to wear clothes, and once in particular the patriarchy then wanted to control women's sex and reproduction, then controlling them via clothing was a very good way of doing that. And then an unclothed woman becomes only really seen in a sexual context. So, I do often see, from feminist friends who are writers and so on, saying they worry about bringing boys into the world and how they're, they want them to be able to dream of girls, but they want the girls that they dream of to be real women, not cyborgs. And my answer to that isn't, the problem isn't really pornography. It is the fact that we are so uncomfortable with seeing bodies in everyday contexts. And if we did, then, we wouldn't have a warped impression of those bodies. So, yeah. And I do think, one of the things that I argue in Naked Feminism is if you look at the societies that most repress women's ability to do what they want with their bodies, where you have, say, compulsory hijabs, you don't see that women are safer and better educated and wealthier and healthier. In fact, you see the opposite. So, I do think a lot of feminists are buying into this idea that modesty is protection. Modesty is this silver bullet that can resolve gender inequality, that if only women cover up more and have less sex, less casual sex, that we can command more respect, that we can be seen differently by men. But, if it was as easy as a piece of cloth and crossing your legs, solving gender inequality, I'd be the first to do it. But, the evidence is that the societies that do that, women end up cut out of education in the workplace because their families worry about them mixing with men, their bodies being seen and touched. They end up reluctant to seek help from doctors because going to a doctor, having a smear test, having your breasts examined for breast cancer means that you're breaking that kind of modesty norm. You end up perhaps not able to participate in sports because when you do that, you might perspire, you might show off your legs, you might need to take your top off because you're, getting hot. So actually, I think modesty, the cult of female modesty, what I call it naked feminism, is the problem, not the monetization of women's bodies.
Can I add to that, if I may? So it seems to me that there's a very important distinction embodied in your question between structure and agency. right, to critical social scientific phenomena. And so the structure is bound in the range of norms that you've identified. And so given the structure, qua norms, when you see agential dissenting acts that might seem to violate the norm, that it seems like the very act of agency, which I would argue to be at the heart of what makes, among other things, liberalism, like a vital principle of human life, that in itself becomes problematized. So I think, embodied in your question and in Victoria's statement is this, there's an interesting dialectic tension, right? You need to kind of negotiate, right? Living in multiple worlds at once where you've got structures, including modesty norms, but you also ought to really have a respect for the right of agency as well, especially if it doesn't particularly harm third parties. Now, your question alludes to it might, children and whatnot, but I don't know what the evidence for that might be, but my presumption would be no. And, there's a whole range I will add besides in terms of the history of classical liberalism where, for example, John Stuart Mill argued against public health legislation because he saw it as a ruse to try to eliminate the exercise of economic agency in terms of sex work.
And you see that with lifestyle restrictions now. We've got the tobacco and vapes bill going through Parliament, which the government want to tell adults what they can and cannot do. I will say, I think Victoria was the first person that actually, for me, gave an explanation for why there is this need to cover up women. And it is interesting that there is that paternity uncertainty explanation, which is, whether it be true or not, it's the first explanation I've ever come across that sounded, as though it made sense. Any other questions? Okay, yes, let's go here.
I have also a question for Dr. Novak. You said
Just
that...
call me Mikayla, it's all good.
Sorry.
Yeah.
You said that markets aren't teleological, so there's no goal. And I think that the problem might be that the LGBTQ community has certain goals, right? You want maybe more representation, you want certain rights. And I think you said correctly that markets can definitely help achieving that. They do. I mean, for example, Pride Month is a big representation. But I don't think it's necessarily the case, right? I mean, that sort of depends on that this culture is seen as a bit hip or cool, like it is in the moment. But if maybe the societal atmosphere would change, then there wouldn't be a demand for this in the market, and they would be sort of pushed out of the market. And that would be my worry with this very market-focused approach, that it could also go exactly the other direction.
So the very market approach is a reflection on my part, a deliberate one for this kind of forum to sort of emphasise the economic implications of these economic exchange fora with respect to the welfare of LGBTQ community, but I also, and I didn't sort of pursue it because it was probably complicated, but we're now getting into complicated terrain, so I welcome the question. And so the complication now is that we actually start realising, in fact, and liberalism actually conveys this itself when I talk about a triad of commitments, that, these commitments, they're entangled. And actually human life is very much entangled, where we have human action and interactivity across different domains. Now, some of the, with respect to the different domains, market, society, politics, the relative influence, even the perceived relative importance to individuals and communities of those, right, to the achievements of goals, understanding, of course, that even politics is non-teleological when properly understood. But mind you, it really depends on individual percepts, right? We actually support individual subjectivities and they can differ. And so you'll be right in saying that there will be elements, definitely, within the LGBT community who will problematise markets, who will sort of discount how beneficial markets are. I'm basically making a normative point to be sure there's that element too. But I don't disagree with you in saying that, sure, I mean, society, culture is important, that's become almost it's not a hegemonic influence, but it's, it's been, significantly important, right, in sort of modern life since the 90s, the mainstreaming of a culture, right, and that has contributed to sort of a formal politics. But I'd also say that certainly markets have been extremely important in the picture, and you just can't neglect it.
Other questions?
Recently, with the someone high up in the Japanese government made like this tweet talking about a new policy they were thinking of implementing, where they were banning marriage for women over the age of 30. What do you think about the usage of economic and social policy to control?
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on. That's a wonderful modern day example, actually, of how the state is, I think, one of the biggest obstacles we face as women today. Let me give another modern example. The United Nations in 1995 met to agree in Beijing a Universal Declaration of Women's Rights. Now, it has included women's sexual and reproductive freedoms until this week. So there's been a lot of fanfare this week from the UN about recommitting to this Declaration of Women's Rights. It's all over social media. Isn't this great? This is, recommitting to gender equality. They have ditched from their long document women's sexual and reproductive freedoms. That's gone. Why is it gone? Because Donald Trump's America and Russia, what unites them, what is driving their friendship right now, it is anti-LGBT and it is anti-women's reproductive freedoms. And so, behind the scenes, it is those countries and a few other that have had, my understanding, women's sexual and reproductive freedoms taken out of this declaration. And that's a sad thing, because women cannot be free unless they have freedom over their bodies. Sadly, whether it is the state, whether it's society, there's still a lot of work to be done.
Absolutely, so much work to be done. Other questions?
I have a question. Yeah. Thank you. Firstly, thank you so much, because it's my first time looking at minorities in this way. So it's really like innovative approach for me. And I got a question, and it's about intersection, because as we can face, me as a woman, as a white woman, or I can reflect or face more problems, I don't know, depending on my age, my health also, the kind of illness I can have or not. So how we can see intersection in this like market forces, and of course also how to avoid the cosification of our values and thoughts just to be important when, I don't know, there's a lot of demand in going to a gay bar or going to a bookstore that is from a person who is from the LGBTQ community. So I thought these kind of things that make me think a little bit more about that.
Yeah, look, if I may, so so the intersectionality sort of issue. So I'm actually just finished up a sort of paper I'm going to present in Cincinnati in May about sort of diversity. And so I got this sort of, I've been writing about for some time this idea of a colliding society, very highly dynamized, very fluid society. I've sort of been starting to think about, what's the implication of human diversity in all of its, rich and wonderful and often yet unknowable tapestry in this sort of colliding, fluid world. I call it the liquid society, drawing on sort of Zygmunt Bauman and among other people. And so it's leading me to actually wonder just how useful political projects, especially intersectionality, actually are. I'll explain why. So we actually see within the sort of loose coalition of the LGBTQ community, we actually see sort of tensions, especially revealed in more recent times, between sort of groups within the broad alliance. And so, for example, you'll see sort of the fracturing of, let's say, the T element away from the LGB. So you've got the LGB alliance, for example, that want to extricate themselves from association with the T. And my personal view is that in a free society, go for it, right? Do what you like. But that's just an indication where sort of this idea of intersectionality has to be seen sort of dynamically, right? So there's no necessary... The only way in which intersectionality can be understood in this view is as a contingency that's always subject to change. And then furthermore, we have to recognise that even within these communities, members of this loose alliance and even people who are coded by the letters, for example, so let's say the lesbian community, and I can actually think of, like, the top of my head, probably almost 24 subcultures, and then I can think about that even within subcultures of folks that I've met in my time who actually have very different perspectives, from the American, let's say in the American sense, lesbian Republicans, yeah, they exist, lesbian, Democrats, and so what I'm saying here, and this is reflected in academic literature as well, so Chandran Kukathas, Adam Tebel talk about minorities within minorities, and I think the implication of understanding minorities within minorities probably weakens, I think, the salience of intersectionality as some sort of explanatory variable, because even intersectionality of the group kind is still a reductive kind of interpretation of the individual who, embodies far more sort of markers of diversity than any group. I mean, that's just a kind of a logical kind of thing. So, yeah, I understand the intersectionality argument. I challenge it because we live in a fluid, dynamic world.
On that dynamism point, I mean, the Hayek, who the Hayek Society is named after, a former lecturer here at the LSE, wrote The Use of Knowledge in Society, and that, you cannot possibly ever understand the reasoning behind every single individual's economic preferences and why they make certain decisions. And so it's, from a central planning perspective, it's impossible to know exactly what goes into an individual's decision to join LGB Alliance or indeed to join other organisations. You can't possibly know that. And so a central government can't possibly plan for that. And so a market system allows for all of those preferences to be catered for.
Can I add just one thing? The eroticisation of, say, Asian women's bodies, say, women's bodies in the Far East, the stereotypes that grew around the bodies of African women, these kind of racial stereotypes that developed in history, I would say are driven largely by imperial pursuit, by empire, because it was through casting other societies as primitive, casting their women as harlots, for example, that the European imperial project was able to justify itself as bringing civilization to the world. So wherever Europeans, rampaged across the world and found, say, naked women alongside naked men out in Australasia or in, parts of Africa, where they found, for example, sex worker brothels in the Far East, this then drove racial stereotypes that sadly still have a legacy today. But, what's driving that was empire. That is the ultimate, state project, isn't it? That is not free markets, that's the state.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much. I'm afraid we've run out of time, I'm so sorry. But if you want to come up and ask your questions, then please do. The formal proceedings will end now at 8 o'clock. Thank you so much to both of you for coming. It was absolutely and a huge thank you to all of you for watching and listening. If you are a student at LSE, consider joining the LSE Hayek Society. And if you are interested in learning a bit about careers in think tanks, the industry in which I work in, please do come and speak to me. We have lots of internship opportunities, so if you are interested, come and let me know. Thank you. Thanks. That was great.